In Stan Bowman's first year as Edmonton Oilers general manager, he's made a flurry of in-season moves and a pair of trades before the season even started. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, as part of our mid-season recap, we break down those moves, how the coaching staff has implemented those lineup changes, and just how good both Kris Knoblauch and Stan Bowman are doing at their respective jobs in today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I'm your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. On today's show, breaking down general manager, coaching staff, the decision-making, the processes, if we can understand what they're trying to do, and if it's working. So we're going to start with the transactions of Stan Bowman as general manager of the Edmonton Oilers so far. I was very tepid on bringing in Stan Bowman for a variety of reasons, both on the ice stuff as far as his decision-making that ultimately sped up the downfall and the dissolution of the Blackhawks window of contention, of his character concerns based on how he handled that the Kyle Beach and Brad Aldrich situation in Chicago, put a question into how you could trust his decision-making, his leadership. But he is the general manager of the Edmonton Oilers in spite of said concerns and baggage. So, in fairness to that job, we are going to break down the transactions and decisions he has made so far. So, the first pair of moves Stan Bowman made back in the summer in August, he got hired late July. It took about a month for the process to get going. But the first pair of moves, trading a fourth-round pick for Vasily Podkolzin, which has worked out tremendously well. And we'll talk about that one in a second. And then swapping Cody Ceci for Ty Emberson and a draft pick. And both moves had a cost-cutting tinge to them. The Oilers had to make a decision based on the Blues offer sheets for Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway. And in spite of the Oilers choosing not to match them, they did need more financial flexibility. The Oilers needed more money to operate this year based on the decisions they had made, because on the first day of free agency, they went out there and they signed Jeff Skinner. They signed Victor Arvidsson. So to afford those decisions effectively, money had to go out. The Oilers didn't have clarity on what their course of action was going to be with Evander Kane for the regular season. So the LTIR proposition wasn't probably as in focus as it could have been if they knew what was going to happen on that end. But continuing down that line of thought, Podkolzin has worked out better than anyone could have conceivably imagined. This is a player that started the season on the fourth line with Derek Ryan and Corey Perry and has played his way into a top six role. Now, Podkolzin's traits don't profile him as a top six forward. You know, he's probably going to top out around his career high in goals, which was 14 in Vancouver a couple of years ago. He's got 6 through 55 games. His shooting percentage is a bit lower than his career average, so there's always the possibility of a little bit of an explosion, counting stats-wise down the second half of the season. But most importantly, his forechecking, his puck retrievals, it has unlocked a different component to Leon Draisaitl's game. And that second line, even if it's not the most eye-popping in terms of stats other than Draisaitl, you know, Arvidsson and Podkolzin aren't world beaters. They're not supremely high-end players. It has worked out well enough that even though I'm a bit concerned how much the Oilers are playing Leon and Connor together, especially over the last 3 to 4 weeks or so, I still feel like Podkolzin and Draisaitl are kind of one of the two pairings that this lineup has continually been oriented around. As for Ty Emberson, Emberson was a roll of the dice, a dart throw, somebody the Oilers pro scouting department identified as a bit of an overager, 27 career NHL games coming into the season for the Sharks as a 24-year-old. someone who didn't have a ton of NHL experience, but they felt they could bring along in a controlled environment with a veteran, responsible partner in Brett Kulak or Darnell Nurse. If you'll recall, at the beginning of the season, there was real conjecture about who was going to play with who, what made the most sense. If you go back and watch an episode from October, November, you'll probably find me saying the Oilers need to play Nurse with Evan Bouchard and need to play Ekholm with Emerson or Kulak or Travis Dermott or whomstever you wanted to put on that second pair. And we'll talk about Travis Dermott as well in a minute, to try and mitigate some of the risk because things were so volatile. But the Oilers, they stuck to their guns. Their defensive pairs have sorted themselves out really well. They have really good underlying numbers in the defensive metrics. Some of that, of course, is tied to their puck possession game as an offense, but there's not as much responsibility on the defense, just to be situationally aware. Next, the Mike Hoffman and Travis Dermott PTOs. Mike Hoffman, just a dart throw. They wanted to see if there was anything left in the tank there. There wasn't. He had a rough preseason, didn't end up getting picked up anywhere. And then as for Travis Dermott, they were auditioning guys. The Oilers came into the year knowing they needed one more defenseman, no matter what, even if everything went well, just because you need the volume of bodies. And Dermott played a handful of games, wasn't awful, wasn't good, just, replacement level player. The Oilers put him on waivers once they got a little bit healthier on the back end. The Wild, who were painfully injured at the time, claimed him off of waivers, where he's been since. No harm, no foul on either of those moves. A PTO getting converted to a regular contract happens pretty often. The Oilers are a competitive team that players want the opportunity to play on, so that's reasonable for me. Claiming Kasperi Kapanen off of waivers was interesting at the time. He's a NHL caliber player. He is not special. He is not above average. He skates really fast. He shoots the puck really hard. Those are both useful traits. They give the Oilers a bit more foot speed throughout the lineup. I think if Kapanen is going to play on the fourth line come playoff time, that's perfectly fine. I don't think he's a top 9 forward at this stage of his career. I think there are worse players in a pinch. You could slide up into the top 9 if you had a difficult situation where you had injuries, you needed to figure something out. I don't think Kapanen is anything of note, but he's not bad. He was a functional NHL player. The Oilers claimed when they were missing Zach Hyman and Victor Arvidsson, and they had a need. Kapanen went right into the top 6. He played a little with Leon. He played a little with Connor. He's played on the third line. He's played on the fourth line. He is a functional NHL caliber player that does not look out of place at the NHL level. He's not going to win you any games, and in an ideal world, he won't lose them either with some bad mistakes. The last in-season transaction worth discussing as far as the general manager is concerned is signing John Klingberg earlier in February, end of January, whatever. When the Oilers signed John Klingberg, it sent a very clear message. We think the medical procedure went well. We think he can give us something without having to burn an asset, and the Oilers are going to see what he has in the tank. In the conversation on Friday with Austin Hockey, we talked a bit about just throwing him to the fire, 17, 18 minutes right out of the gate. First hockey in 13 months, playing with Nurse against quality competition. And he's only played 5 games. I want to be fair. I don't think Klingberg has been bad. I don't think he's been good. I think he's very much just trying to get his feet under him at the speed of an NHL game again, because it's been a while, and I'm willing to be patient. The Oilers have the rest of the month of February, the first 6 days of March, to determine if Klingberg is somebody they can bank on going forward into the playoffs as a regular in their defensive core. But if he isn't, they have that 6 weeks to make a decision on if he's not good enough, where do we pivot to? What do we do as far as roster cap situation? So this isn't a bad thing that they're giving him run to try and figure it out now. We are going to take our first break of today's show. When we come back, we're going to talk about Kris Knoblauch's side of things coming up next. When the game tips off, NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whenever me and my friends are together, we love doing a squad ride, picking something we can all bet on together, make the game that much more exciting. Plus, the FanDuel app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook betting partner of the NBA. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are breaking down the stakeholders in their performance through the first 55 games of the regular season. So, this recap series, we did offense, defense, goaltending last week. We did a bigger picture, open-ended conversation with Austin Hockey about the Oilers at large. We did a Four Nations face-off preview. All of this is to kind of evaluate how the Oilers have gone so far, to put their performance in context, to give you a good idea of what to expect in the second half of the season, what's realistic, how to not get your feelings hurt, because ultimately, part of being a sports fan is preparing your brain for that arduous journey of, we played 82 regular season games. Now we need to play in the playoffs, and we need to win 4 best-of-7 series to win the best trophy in sports. It's going to take a while to get there, but how they perform over time and how things change and evolve, that does matter. So, as far as Kris Knoblauch, I, as an individual on a personal level, I personally enjoy the way that Kris Knoblauch communicates. There are some coaches in the NHL who like to obfuscate, who are difficult, who aren't personable. And whenever I see Kris Knoblauch speak, I feel like he is being direct. I feel like he is effectively communicating his ideas. And I think that's important. And I know there are a lot of people who like to be know-it-alls and say, well, the coach doesn't owe the fans anything. The coach doesn't have to tell us. If you are a good communicator, you can help people understand that in the way you say things. A good communicator is able to give information in a way that is informative without giving away the store, for that expression, giving away the kitchen sink. You want your coach to be able to articulate their thoughts in a way that come off as insightful and meaningful. Because if he can do that without giving anything away while talking to the media so the public can kind of get an understanding, that means he knows how to get to his guys. And that's really why it matters to me. Ultimately, no, it doesn't matter if your coach is personable or likable or an effective communicator through the media. If the guys on the team respond to how he coaches, that's ultimately what matters. But I do feel that it's not a coincidence that John Cooper is considered the best coach in the NHL, coaching Team Canada at Four Nations, because his ability to communicate and give meaningful perspective on his team's games, his opponents, what makes them good, what makes them bad, that shows me somebody who takes time and is thoughtful. And that's an important trait in a leader and a decision maker. And the decisions this year for the Oilers haven't been as, I'll say, important. Whereas last year when Kris Knoblauch came in, it was, we are at the bottom of the standings and we need to turn this ship around right now. Don't get me wrong. 5-1 start, 2 goals a game for the first 10 games of the regular season. All of that bad. But the Oilers showed resolve. They were able to dust themselves off, start playing better hockey. Their special teams stabilized, and the performances have since stabilized. The key decisions, to me at least, Knoblauch has made so far this year. Number one, most importantly, giving Brett Kulak more minutes, playing him on his offside with Darnell Nurse, and letting the defense play very situationally dependent hockey. I don't know how practical it is that Troy Stecher was averaging 13 some odd minutes a game, Emerson only 15 something minutes a game, because that's just too much of a burden on your top guys for an entire regular season. Of course, on a night-to-night basis, you're not monitoring how many minutes guys are playing for the whole season. In a given game, you're kind of managing off of the flow of the game, the situations. If there's more penalties than usual, you got to play your killers. If you have more power play opportunities, your killers are going to play less. So guys' minutes do tend to stabilize over the course of an entire season. But ideally, you want Bouchard, 22 minutes a game, Ekholm 22, 23 minutes a game, because in the playoffs, that number is going to creep up. It's going to be 25, 26 minutes a game in the playoffs, and you're expecting that for 4 rounds, and you have to be making conscious management decisions in the regular season for when you get there, because the Oilers are in a position where they have afforded themselves the type of cushion that will allow them to worry about the playoffs, where even if they have a bad week or two, they are firmly in the mix for a playoff spot. And that's really in conjunction with the John Klingberg conversation we had at the end of the first segment, that they have the next 5 weeks to, not 5 weeks, excuse me, the next 3.5, 4 weeks to audition Klingberg for the role they have in mind. I think Klingberg is probably better suited for a third pair role at this phase of his career. His mobility looks okay, but something just doesn't look right. He's a little awkward right now. It very much looks like he's still getting his feet under him and really trying to get a feel for the speed of the game, which is normal. He hasn't played in a hockey game since the fall of 2023. It's been a while, and getting up to game speed takes time. You think about Darnell Nurse, who didn't have a preseason, didn't have a training camp. They threw him in the lineup game 1 of the season, and it took him a month and change to get his feet under him, to look like he was at game speed. So that tells me they want to see if he can do this, because if he can show improvement over the course of the next few weeks, the shopping list gets changed. What you would ask Stan Bowman to go out and get, it's different. If Klingberg is going to play well with Darnell Nurse, okay, I think we only need to go out and get a spare defenseman, somebody who's only going to play if we have an injury problem. We can push Stetcher out of the lineup as a regular, and we can go and get an extra guy with that similar profile who low event, low risk, 7th defenseman, plays if there's injuries. Coach doesn't have to worry about him. He's not going to do anything flashy, but in the role he's going to play, it's going to be about risk aversion and limiting what's going on. The other decisions that come to mind as far as evaluating Knoblauch season, the management of Jeff Skinner is probably my only real gripe with Knoblauch this year, but I can at least understand to some degree why he's coached Skinner the way he has. There is an expectation that you're going to have a commitment to defense. And we know Jeff Skinner is not a defense-first forward. There are very few forwards in the NHL who are well-rounded enough to have the scoring profile that Skinner does, to also be a great chance preventer defensive player. It's a rare skill set for someone to have both. And I hate to use, Facebook or fortune cookie wisdom, but if you ask a fish to climb a tree, you're going to get bad results. Asking Jeff Skinner to be a defensive first forward is not something that's really in his toolbox, but I do think he has shown a willingness to play with a little bit more of a defense first tinge to his game. And he has played reasonably well, that I would like to see him get one more real run in the top 6, whether it's with Leon or whether it's with Connor, just to see what's there. Because if you can, massage 10, 15 goals over the final 25, 30 games out of him, you get 10 goals in 25 games out of Jeff Skinner. That doesn't sound like a lot, but in that short of a sample size, that'll matter. And he'd be going into the playoffs with some extra confidence, and that would matter. Another one, playing Podkolzin in the top 6, seeing the results are real, they're sticky, they're good, and leaving him there in spite of the fact that the organization paid Jeff Skinner in the offseason, that shows conviction, and it shows trust in your instincts. And I think that matters. And last year in the playoffs, I really was impressed with Knoblauch's ability to push the right buttons at the right time to get desired results, whether it was going from Pickard to Skinner, whether it was pulling Ceci from the lineup for Broberg, playing Broberg on his offside, just a willingness to try things out and do whatever he could to try and get the best possible performance, because ultimately that's your coach's job. Put your guys in a position to succeed. They go out there, they succeed, they make you look smart. And that's what happened last year in the playoffs. And to a good extent, that's what's happened so far this year. We are going to take our final break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the decisions that Knoblauch and Bowman have to make over these final 25 games, how they might line up their view, and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to keep you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no-shell variety. It's the perfect grab-and-go snack for a busy day, whether I'm snacking or on a road trip like I am this week. I have 3 packs of these in my bag. Or if you know me, you know I'm very serious about my fitness and my nutrition. I need a quick protein boost. They are a good way to get those macros in. So get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are finishing our first 55 games recap, evaluation, report cards, parent-teacher conference, whatever you want to call this type of evaluation, because this is a natural benchmark in the season. We would typically be calling this the All-Star break check-in, but there's no All-Star break. We're doing 4 nations. I am cautiously optimistic about the trajectory of the Oilers. You heard me talk about this with Austin on Friday's show. As long as the Oilers continue to leave me with the impression that they have a little bit more juice to squeeze out of the group that's already here, that's a good thing to me. That the Oilers keep finding ways to win games, even if it's not pretty, even if it's not conventional. And do they have a quality of competition problem? Do they struggle against the better teams? I think you can make that argument. Their record against teams in playoff spots is not great, but teams that win, that matters. It matters that you find ways to win, even if it's against bad teams, even if it's against mediocre teams, because if you're not on your A game and you're still finding ways to win, that tells me if you get to your A game, you're going to be able to beat the teams that you might not be better than. That's going to tell me you have a chance against those teams. And I know it's not the most encouraging thing in the world to hear me talking about the betting favorite to win the Stanley Cup, talking about having a chance. But ultimately, that's all a team can do, is have a chance to win. They're never going to be able to guarantee you a win. That's just not the way sports work. But the Oilers are putting themselves in a position where they are going to be able to add at the trade deadline. They're going to be able to add probably 2 pieces, if I had to guess, and really augment, shore up the deficiencies. I do think they probably need one more top 9 forward. Whether or not that's Evander Kane remains to be seen. I am not certain he's going to return for the regular season. I think if anything, he's almost assuredly going to be a game 1, round 1 lineup decision when the salary cap won't be a factor to consider. We will see how the John Klingberg audition process continues to go. He's got a nice little layoff here after his first 5 games. He can go home. He can get ready. And then we've got a bit of a sprint here. 25 games sounds like a lot. We're talking about maybe 6.5 weeks of hockey from the middle of February through the middle of April, and that'll be it. The Oilers don't have a ton of time here to get to that next level, but the matter of the fact is they're tied for first with a game in hand on the Golden Knights. They haven't won the division in more than 30 years. They are in their best position at this point in the season of the McDavid-Draisaitl era. They are well positioned to continue improving, to continue extracting positive regression from players like Victor Arvidsson or Jeff Skinner or Ryan Nugent-Hopkins or Adam Henrique or Connor Brown or Matthias Janmark, who had slow or under career average first 55 games. And with all of that in mind, 9 of their 14 forwards are shooting under their career shooting percentage this year. And again, that might be a reflection of league-wide it just being harder to score this year. But it's also a possible sign that the Oilers have a little more to get out of their existing group on top of whatever they might go on to add to this team at the trade deadline. That's kind of the goal. You don't want to have to add key contributors at the trade deadline. That is not typically something we see correlated with Stanley Cup glory. You know, it's typically a middle six forward or a bottom pair defenseman to kind of put a group that's already having success over the top. You know, last year for the Panthers, it was Tarasenko. The year before that for Vegas, it was Ivan Barbashev. Before that for Colorado, it was Arturi Lehkonen. For Tampa Bay, it was David Savard. It was Blake Coleman. It was Barclay Goodrow. These are not huge swings. These are not dramatic roster changes, because if you need that big of a contributor, that probably tells you your roster wasn't good enough to be in that tier of team. And having requisite quality depth is a hallmark of any Stanley Cup championship caliber team. Last year's Oilers team was pretty damn close. That group was very impressive. It had a nice distribution of offense throughout the lineup, but you lost Evander Kane midway through the playoffs. You lost a little bit of your juice. You had to go back to the drawing board in the offseason. You had to find ways to cut costs in certain places. And I feel confident in Kris Knoblauch as a coach. He has done more than enough over the course of his year and change as Oilers coach to give me the belief that he knows how to get the most out of this group and what works for this group. And that's a good feeling to have, because frankly, there aren't that many coaches in the NHL who inspire confidence. And look, I'm never going to agree 100% with anyone. That's just the way humanity works. We all value different things. We have different priorities. We have different ethical principles. And I'm not asking to agree with everything they do or for them to say what I do. I just want to be able to understand your decision making, because as long as I can understand it, I might not agree with it, but as long as I understand it, that works for me. If I can tell, oh, you're doing this because of this, it lets me know you're a rational person who's based in evidence. If you are making decisions that I cannot understand, that leads me to believe to some degree you might be acting irrationally or not acting in the best interest of the team. You know, we see general managers do this all the time, where they're not in a playoff spot and they burn a draft pick or a prospect on a mid-tier player to try and just get to the playoffs in the hopes of being able to tell their boss, hey, we made the playoffs, even though the reason your team needed to go out and burn those assets in the first place was your own doing in the first place. But as far as Stan Bowman, I think his roster transactions, the waiver claims, signing John Klingberg, they show a willingness to be experimental, which is good. You always want your GM to take chances on being able to improve your team, especially if it only costs money. Money is a lot easier to come by than draft picks. It's always better to solve your problems with money in sports from a roster perspective than having to trade away players or draft picks, because money comes back around. The cap will start to actually work in the Oilers' favor going forward. That puts you in a position where you can make up roster decisions down the road, where you can put guys on waivers, you can trade players away if you need to in salary dump situations. So I am cautiously optimistic about the Oilers' trajectory. We will learn a lot about Stan Bowman's evaluation of his own team and what he thinks it takes to win in today's NHL based on how he handles the upcoming trade deadline. If they go out and get Jake Evans and a seventh defenseman, that tells you he thinks they're pretty close, that they just need a little bit more of a specialist for that fourth line center role. They want to put the guys they already have in good positions, while also giving them a pat on the back and saying, hey, you guys did a good job the first 60 games of the season. Here's a little bit more help. We think you guys are good. This guy is good at this. He's going to help us be better at this. So if that's a face-off guy, if that's a penalty killer, if it's a third goalie, which I've kind of started to come around on being the Oilers' most prudent decision, something that would help them out a lot as far as their playoff trajectory, just in case something were to happen to Stuart Skinner, I would be very open to adding a third goalie to this mix, whether that's a John Gibson or a Melka or a Jonathan Quick. There are goalies out there that would be very helpful for where the Oilers are in the pecking order as far as the West and the NHL at large. But that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell. I will talk to you guys tomorrow, where we are going to do a more in-depth trade deadline evaluation of this is what the Oilers need. This is who's available that fits that need. This is what it's going to cost to get them. I'll see you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.